Welcome to Future Epoch, where we learn more about our world. By 2020, more than 500,000 Americans had died from opioid overdoses. Not in a war. Not from a natural disaster. From a pill that was sold to their doctors as safe, effective, and unlikely to cause addiction. The drug was called OxyContin. The company that made it was called Purdue Pharma. And the family behind it would become one of the most scrutinized dynasties in American corporate history. Opioids are a class of drugs that act on receptors in the brain to reduce pain. They include natural compounds derived from the opium poppy, synthetic versions manufactured in laboratories, and everything in between. Used carefully and for short periods, they can provide genuine relief to people suffering from acute or terminal pain. The problem is that they are also powerfully addictive. The brain adapts to them quickly, and when the drug is removed, the withdrawal is brutal. These risks were not new. Physicians had understood the dangers of opioid dependence for well over a century. What changed in the mid-1990s was a company's decision to obscure those risks in pursuit of profit. Purdue Pharma was a privately held pharmaceutical company owned and controlled by the Sackler family. The Sacklers were already wealthy and well-connected before OxyContin existed. Arthur Sackler, a physician and advertising pioneer who had died in 1987, had helped establish the family's approach to pharmaceutical marketing decades earlier, promoting drugs directly to physicians in ways that were aggressive by the standards of the time. His brothers Mortimer and Raymond inherited the company and built it further. The next generation, including Richard Sackler, would preside over its most consequential chapter. In 1996, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin, a slow-release formulation of oxycodone. The slow-release design was intended to provide steady pain relief over 12 hours, and the company made it the centerpiece of an extraordinary marketing campaign. Sales representatives visited doctors across the country, promoting OxyContin not just for cancer patients or end-of-life care, but for a much broader population of people living with chronic pain, including back pain, arthritis, and workplace injuries. Purdue offered free trials, sponsored pain management conferences, and developed a prescriber data system to identify which doctors were writing the most opioid prescriptions, then deployed representatives to visit them more frequently. The claim at the heart of the campaign was a specific, and, it would later emerge, deeply misleading one, that OxyContin's slow-release formula made it less likely to cause addiction than immediate-release opioids. A Purdue medical liaison made the claim that fewer than 1% of patients who took the drug would become addicted. This figure had no credible scientific basis. It was used anyway. Sales grew rapidly. By 2001, OxyContin was generating more than $1 billion a year for Purdue Pharma. In Appalachian towns, in rural communities across Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia, in places where factory work had declined and physical labor was common, prescriptions multiplied. Pill mills, clinics that prescribed opioids with little or no clinical justification, began operating in some of the most vulnerable communities in the country. People who became dependent on the pills found that when supplies were cut or prices rose, heroin was cheaper and easier to obtain. The overdose rate began to climb. The central conflict in the Purdue Pharma story is not simply that a company made a dangerous drug. It is that the company's leadership knew, or had reason to know, that the drug was being misused at scale and continued to sell it. Internal documents that eventually became public through litigation showed that Purdue executives received reports of widespread abuse, of OxyContin being crushed and snorted or dissolved and injected to bypass the slow-release mechanism, and that they took steps to manage the reputational and legal risk while continuing to maximize sales. In 2007, Purdue Frederick, the company's subsidiary, pleaded guilty to federal charges of misbranding OxyContin by falsely claiming it was less addictive than other opioids. 3 senior executives also pleaded guilty as individuals. The company paid $600 million in fines and settlements, which was at the time one of the largest amounts ever paid in a pharmaceutical criminal case. For a company that had generated several $billion from the drug, it was a cost of doing business. The Sackler family, who had received billions of dollars in distributions from Purdue over the years, faced no criminal charges in 2007. The family continued to donate to universities, museums, and cultural institutions, attaching their name to galleries and wings at institutions including the Louvre, the Tate Modern, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Smithsonian. The Sackler name was prestigious. The crisis they had helped create was being blamed on patients, on street dealers, on a culture of dependency. The legal pressure continued to build. State attorneys general began filing suit. Investigative journalists, including Patrick Radden Keefe of The New Yorker, published detailed accounts of the family's role in the crisis, drawing on internal documents that emerged through discovery. Purdue Pharma had also hired McKinsey & Company to help devise strategies for boosting OxyContin sales, even as the overdose crisis was drawing national attention. McKinsey's recommendations included tactics to target high-prescribing doctors and counter concerns about addiction. The consultancy would later agree to pay nearly $600 million to resolve investigations by state attorneys general. In September 2019, facing an avalanche of lawsuits from more than 2,600 state and local governments, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy. In 2020, the United States Department of Justice announced a global resolution of its criminal and civil investigations into Purdue Pharma. The company agreed to plead guilty to 3 federal criminal charges, including conspiracy to defraud the United States and violate federal anti-kickback laws, and agreed to pay more than $83 billion, one of the largest resolutions in the history of the Department of Justice. The Sackler family separately agreed to pay approximately $6 billion to resolve civil claims, while admitting no wrongdoing. A provision in the initial bankruptcy settlement would have granted members of the Sackler family broad immunity from future civil lawsuits, effectively shielding individuals who had never themselves filed for bankruptcy from claims they had not yet faced. In June 2024, the United States Supreme Court struck down that provision in a 5-4 ruling, finding that the bankruptcy court did not have the authority to grant such sweeping protection to the Sacklers. The legal exposure of individual family members remained unresolved. The human cost sits beyond any settlement figure. The CDC estimates that more than 500,000 people died from overdoses involving opioids between 1919 and 2020. The crisis did not end when Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy. It evolved. Prescription opioid overdoses were followed by a wave of heroin deaths, and then by a fentanyl crisis that continues to claim tens of thousands of lives each year. Communities that lost a generation of working-age adults are still rebuilding. The economic cost to the United States has been estimated in the trillions of dollars when accounting for lost productivity, healthcare, and criminal justice expenditure. The opioid crisis is sometimes described as an accident, as though a well-intentioned drug simply turned out to be more dangerous than anyone expected. The documentary record suggests something different. It suggests a company that made a calculated decision to prioritize sales over safety, that used misleading claims to expand a market far beyond what the evidence supported, and that used wealth and legal resources to delay accountability for years. The regulatory system that was meant to prevent this outcome failed. The FDA approved OxyContin with a label that contained the misleading addiction claim. Congress, following lobbying by the pharmaceutical industry, limited the enforcement powers of the DEA at a critical moment. The consultancy hired to boost sales understood the human context in which those recommendations will be implemented. Accountability, when it came, arrived unevenly and late. The Purdue Pharma story raises a question that no settlement has answered. How do we hold a private family responsible for a public catastrophe when they exercise their power through a corporate structure designed, in part, to absorb the consequences they were never meant to bear personally? The $6 billion the Sacklers agreed to pay is a significant sum. It is also a fraction of the wealth the family accumulated from the drug. The museums that bore their name have been removing the Sackler plaques from their walls. The towns that bore the cost of the crisis are still waiting to understand what justice actually looks like. More than 500,000 people are gone. The pills that killed them were sold by a company that knew the risks and chose to manage them rather than stop. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this content and want to see more, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel.